Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm honoured that it's the first talk you posted in English. I hope you all find it interesting and get something from it. And I'm looking forward to our conversations afterwards. Hopefully we can think about ways in which imprints in early modern English books connect to books printed in Europe and in the Low Countries during this time as well. So in this talk, I'll be considering the format, conventions and significance of the imprint as featured in 16th and 17th century books. By imprint, I am referring to that short statement of publication details that in an early modern printed book typically appears on the title page and provides some of the following information: name of the printer, publisher, wholesaler, and place and date of publication. I've chosen, however, as my opening image here, a painting rather than a book. Still Life is by the Dutch artist Edward Courier, who was active during the late 17th century. This vanitas reproduces in oil paint 2 printed title pages from English books, one of which includes a readable imprint. His Majesty's Most Gracious Speech to both Houses of Parliament was a real publication that recorded William III's speech delivered on the 1st of February 1699 on the disbanding of the army after an unpopular war. The painted imprint indicates that the text was printed by Charles Bill and the executrix of Thomas Newcomb, deceased, printer to the King's Most Excellent Majesty. The reproduction of this printed title page in paint speaks to the usual themes of the vanitas genre, the vanity and transience of human endeavours, but it also implies that title pages, including their imprints, were distinctive and important parts of books. Unlike Courier's painting, though, modern editions of early texts often do not reproduce them. In this talk, I'll concentrate on the imprint and argue that these overlooked paratexts play a critical role in shaping the reading experience and constructing identities of person, place, and text. Central to my argument here is the use of the word imprint as a verb, meaning to print, to stamp, to impress, to fix in the mind, to remember carefully. The imprints of books can make important and lasting statements about the texts they preface and the places and networks to which they refer. I'll be taking my examples mainly from books printed in England, including some of the plays and poems of Shakespeare, but my core arguments are relevant for early modern books printed elsewhere during this time, including in the Low Countries. I'll begin by considering briefly the origins, conventions, and format of the imprint. Prior to the invention of the printing press, the antecedent of the imprint, the colophon, was sometimes a feature of manuscripts, and it often named the scribe of the text, as well as details of its date and occasion. But as Chef Rogers points out, these statements were sometimes personal in nature, expressing gratitude to God in religious works, or a desire for a drink, as in this example here. Colophons appeared at the end of a text, and while they continued to be used in some printed books, especially in the early to mid-16th century, publication details migrated to the front to form the imprint. During the 16th and 17th century, imprints most frequently appear on title pages, alongside other features, which could include the text's main title and a description of its contents, as well as printers' ornaments or woodcuts. Graham Prout has explored these features in detail for books printed in the southern Netherlands, and in English books, there are parallels in function and format. Imprint served a practical function within the burgeoning print marketplace in England by providing basic details about a book's production and often where it could be purchased wholesale. And these paratexts were aimed at both individual readers and members of book trade. On this slide, I've indicated some of the main formats or formulas for imprints. The example on the left is typical for a 15th century imprint printed by John Day. This can be represented by the formula printed by A, where A also acts as the publisher. As the book trade expanded, stationers started to specialize, often working as either printers or booksellers, a shift in working practices that can be seen in the imprint too. The example in the center, printed by John Danter for William Jones, implies that Danter acted as the printer, while Jones, a bookseller, provided the capital and took on the role of the publisher. It can be represented by the formula printed by A for B. The example on the right shows a further breakdown of roles. George L. printed the book, Thomas Thorpe, TT, acted as the publisher and carried the financial risk of the venture, while William Astley acted as the bookseller, or more accurately, wholesaler of the edition. Other booksellers could therefore look to the imprint to find out where they could purchase wholesale copies that they could then sell in their own shops. So at their most basic level, imprints typically let readers know who invested in a text and where it could be purchased wholesale. At a time before authors' copyright privileges, which were not legally introduced in England until 1710, imprints announce which stationers held exclusive rights to the text and controlled its publication, including any future editions. I am, however, interested in the wider significance of imprints, including how they direct reading experiences, construct textual communities, and enter into the fictive world of a text. Title page imprints, in contrast to colophons, were very visible paratexts. Title pages were key promotional materials that, as Tiffany Stern has discussed, doubled as advertisements and were pasted around stalls, posts, doors, and walls to attract book buyers. They needed to provide an enticing snapshot of the text they prefaced. And as satirized in Thomas Nash's The Terrors of the Night, some early modern book browsers looked no further. Nash writes, "A number of you there be who consider neither premises nor conclusions, but piteously torment title pages on every post, never reading further of any book than imprinted by Simeon such a sign, and yet with your dudgeon judgments will desperately presume to run up to the hard hilts the whole bulk of it." Nash, or the narrator, is complaining here that title pages, with special mention given to their imprints, were the only parts of a book that some individuals engaged with. A rushed, inattentive reading experience that did not stop them from fixing judgments on the text as a whole. Indeed, title pages help to direct a reader's interpretation through the selection and presentation of their different components. Imprints serve a practical function, in this example indicating that Nash's edition could be purchased wholesale at the sign of the Gun near Holborn Conduit, but they also have other functions. Nash's emphasis on the imprint as the end of the reading experience seems to draw attention to this wider significance, perhaps indicating that the names and reputations of stationers were appealing enough for an inattentive book browser to linger over. So I'd like to suggest that imprints perform a wider range of functions than are typically recognized. They provide basic publication details, but they can also obscure these details, act as a marker of authority, shape the interpretation of the main text, advertise and construct the reputations of stationers and places, create textual communities, and particularly for us today, help to recover information about textual networks and why certain texts were selected for publication, and by extension, why they survive. I've already discussed the first function, and now I'll turn to the others, giving one or more examples of each. And I should, of course, point out that these functions often overlap and blur together. False imprints. False imprints are a special category of imprints with which I'll begin before moving into a discussion of regular, meaning accurate or relatively accurate imprints. Books sometimes obscure information about their publication by providing false details in the imprint. The reasons for this practice vary, as does the extent to which readers are meant to realize the inaccuracy of the details. One reason for providing false information is to protect the identities of those involved in the publication, which is particularly relevant in the case of potentially contentious texts, or if a stationer were attempting to publish a text that belonged to someone else. To meet these needs, some imprints are absent, ambiguous, or inaccurate. For example, Jesuit Robert Parsons' controversial text, A Brief Discourse containing certain reasons why Catholics refuse to go to church, does not identify its author. It is attributed on the title page to a learned and virtuous man and contains a dedication by I.H. to Elizabeth I of England. I.H. stands for John Howlett, which was one of Parsons' pseudonyms. The imprint claims that the discourse was printed in Douay by John Lyon, whereas it was actually printed in East Ham, London, by the Green Street House Press. Parsons eventually left England for permanent exile on the continent. In 1595, his conference about the next succession to the crown of England, which debated the prohibited subject of Elizabeth I's successor, appears under another pseudonym, R. Dolman, with an imprint claiming it was printed at N with license, which indicates Antwerp. Sometimes false imprints do more than just obscure publication details. They can also, as Helen Smith has discussed, enter into the fictive world of the text, blurring the boundary between text and paratext. If you have watched my introductory blog for this talk, you'll have heard about this example already, but these pamphlets offer such a memorable example of fictive imprints and their contributions to the main text. In England, during the late 1580s, a number of satirical tracts were published under the pseudonym Martin Marprelate, which attacked the Elizabethan Church and its episcopacy. These scandalous pamphlets were printed secretly by travelling presses, and as one would expect, obscured their publication details. But they did so in a way that brought the imprint into the main text and reflected its satirical and exuberant style. In the tract on the left, the epitome, the title page describes the text as printed on the other hand of some of the priests. It was, in fact, printed by Robert Waldegrave in Bowsley House, Northamptonshire. The tract on the on the right, Hey Any Work for Cooper, claims it was printed in Europe, not far from some of the bouncing priests. This text was actually printed in Coventry, England, but the imprint furthers the text's criticism of the church and playfully suggests the boldness of the project. The Elizabethan government hired a number of writers, including John Lilly and Thomas Nash, to counter Martin in print. They produced a series of anti-Martinist pamphlets that adopted similar stylistic and rhetorical strategies, all of which fed into the imprints. Here, the return of the renowned Cavaliero Pasqual of England claims in its imprint, "If my breath be so hot that I burn my mouth, suppose I was printed by Pepper Alley." The description of place seems to echo the pamphlet's purpose, to provide a burning satirical attack on Martin and his criticism of the bishops. I'll give one final example. At the beginning of the 30 Years' War, in 1618 to 1648, James I tried to avoid direct intervention in the conflict and continued to pursue a Spanish marriage match for his son and heir Charles, who would become Charles I. The proposed match was very unpopular in England, especially as it would link Britain with a powerful Catholic nation. The Protestant polemicist Thomas Scott wrote a pamphlet called Robert, Earl of Essex, His Ghost, which offers a call to arms through the person, or more properly ghost, of Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. Essex had been executed in 1601, but his reputation had undergone something of a resurgence by the 1620s. In this text, Essex's ghost, writing from Elysian, urges readers in England to offer a free and cheerful contribution to the new wars, which were ostensibly being fought along Protestant Catholic lines, and to do everything they could to dissuade James from a match with the dangerous Spanish nation. So here is one extract from it. There is here in heaven secret intelligence, that he, not contenting himself with making that league with Spain, hath also entertained a treaty of marriage for the prince his only son, with the daughter of Spain. And certes the very angels have blushed at this news, that your king, who is of so profound judgment, learning, and knowledge in divine matters, should ever assent to a treat of matching his only son with a wife of a contrary religion, especially with an imp sprung from such an incestuous generation as is that of Austria and Spain, or Spain and Austria, choose you whither. Without doubt, King James cannot but know in his conscience that it is directly against the revealed will of God in Holy Writ for Christian princes and people that profess the gospel to match with Roman Catholics, which made himself match with Denmark's daughter, a Protestant princess, and afterwards he matched his only daughter with the Count Palatine, a Protestant prince. Witness also his Majesty's own pen in Basilicandora. In the main text, Essex's ghost here is said to be residing in heaven, where he is speaking in the company of angels, whose reaction to the Spanish match he relates. The book's imprint continues this fiction. It is described as printed in paradise. In place of accurate details, the imprint is mobilized in the service of the text's main argument. The role of these imprints is clear: to obscure the publication details of contentious texts and to play with the conventions of the imprint in ways that further the aims, style, and content of the main text. They construct fictive identities of authority and place that are designed to catch the reader's attention and to be recognized as false. I want now to focus for the rest of this talk on regular imprints that convey accurate publication details to show A, how they provide evidence about real individuals and places, but B, that they also do this in a way that requests imaginative and interpretive engagement from readers. The two core components of an imprint, the details of agent and location, can be seen as authorizing features that inform the reading experience. They can act as markers of authority, not just in the sense of indicating who held the rights to a title, but also as one of several signifiers of a text's authority and significance, which can contribute to its marketability. John Day, for example, was an important publisher of Protestant books, such as John Fox's Acts and Monuments on the left, and Protestant treatises on the right, and he tended to advertise his name prominently in imprints. Alongside other paratextual features, these imprints could make a statement about Day's control over the text and act as an assurance of its authority, reliability, and superiority over others. In 1570, Day published the second edition of a play called Gorboduc by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, which was renamed in his edition The Tragedy of Ferrex and Porrex. The play dramatizes the reign of the ancient British king Gorboduc and the disorder and destruction ensuing from his attempt to divide Britain between his two sons, Ferrex and Porrex. Day wrote a new paratext, the printer, the P to the reader, the printer to the reader, for this second edition, which is in fact the very first address written by a stationer to appear in any English playbook. This address condemns the play's first edition, which had been published in 1565 by one W.G., meaning William Griffith. Day criticizes Griffith for acquiring a copy of the text from some unscrupulous young man's hand, as he puts it, and printing it in an exceedingly corrupted state. Day vividly compares the maligned printing of Gorboduc to the defiling of a fair maid who is left bewrayed and disfigured, unrecognizable to those who knew her previously. Day claims that his edition is the authoritative one. He has the approval of the authors, and he has fixed the corrupted play so that the new edition offers the definitive text. He supports these claims through other markers of authority on the title page. The play has been seen and allowed, and his own name appears in large type within the imprint, seeming to stand in as a kind of security for the text. After one of the title characters, Ferrex, it is Day's name that appears in the next largest type, larger than the Queen's Majesty and the gentleman of the Inner Temple who performed the play. Day's accusations of textual piracy are, in fact, a marketing strategy designed to promote the new edition. His text of the play does not differ significantly from Griffith's edition and contains only a few minor textual variants. Another striking omission is the absence of the dramatists' names on the title page, especially because they had a central position on Griffith's title page, which you can see here on the right. And this title page even specifies the contributions made by Norton and Sackville. It says that the first three acts were written by Norton and the last by Sackville. And Day draws, it's also peculiar because Day draws so much attention to their approval of this new edition within his address, but yet they are absent from Day's title page. It is instead Day's authority that is most conspicuous in his edition, and the imprint underlines this authority, advertising his name in large type and seeming to confirm his control over the text and his assurance of its quality. As Douglas Brooks argues, Day's primary purpose is the re-embodiment and commodification of a play text that had already been printed and marketed by somebody else. An approach that we can see in later publications, including Shakespeare's First Folio, which claims it was published according to the true original copies and not the diverse stolen and surreptitious copies that had appeared previously. So above all, Day's address here draws attention to his agency in the publication process and his control over reader reception. Day's strategies, as featured in the imprints, other title page features, and the paratextual address all affect how readers approach and interpret the main text. I've also already considered this function in false imprints, but even something as local as a stationer's bookshop sign might shape the presentation and reception of a book. For example, in 1606, John Trundle published an anonymous play about the legendary British past and the history of King Eleanor, which features in Tudor chronicles such as Holinshed. The play also contains a subplot involving two characters called Nobody and Somebody, which is mined for comic effect. Trundle's playbook draws attention to the subplot through its two elaborate woodcuts. The figure of Nobody on the title page is all legs and no body, and the figure of Somebody on the final page of the book is all torso. The play's main plot is relegated to a secondary position, even an afterthought. It appears in very small type, buried in the middle of the title page description. Trundle and his bookshop location at the sign of Nobody may have exerted a strong influence on the layout and balance of the title page. His main woodcut is also an advertisement for himself, and it provides some evidence for how one historical reader, the publisher, read the play and weighed up its different storylines. It also directs other readers' experience and expectation of what is important. The main plot involving King Eleanor deals with weak leadership, tyranny, and the importance of stable government. And it was a chronicle history that offered the potential for politic applications in the early Jacobean period. But the presentation of the playbook downplays this aspect. Another title page paratext that is closely connected to the imprint, but which is not a focus of my discussion today, is the printer's or publisher's device. These devices sometimes work together with the imprint in ways that can underline or complicate the imprint as a marker of authority and can shape the interpretation of the main text. To give a brief example, publisher Thomas Pavier invested in the second edition of the anonymous Jack Straw, a history play about the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The first edition of the play had been published in 1594 by John Danter and contained a different title page ornament, while the second edition of 1604, shown here, features an ornament that acts as a calling card for the new publisher, Pavier. It displays Pavier's initials, TP, and an image of a labourer, which, as Adam Hooks points out, is intended to represent a paver and recall Pavier's own name. This device takes on an additional interpretive significance, though, in a history play about the Peasants' Revolt, especially in light of its inscription around the image, "Thou shalt labour till thou return to dust." It suggests an application to the plight of the workers within the play, and the inscription seems to reflect directly on their hardships, prompting a reading that is sympathetic to their uprising against Richard II. Some early modern publishers specialized in certain kinds of texts, such as law books, sermons, or music books, and the appearance or advertisement of their name in imprints could remind readers of their other publications. Imprints can also help to construct the reputations of the stationers and places they name. As suggested by the example from Nash's Terrors of the Night, with which I began, readers' attention was drawn towards the imprint, and any knowledge they had of the names given there was likely to shape their encounter with the text. For example, during the 17th century, St. Paul's churchyard was, in addition to being a site of religious worship, known as a secular hub for political debate, trade, exchange, and the publication of news and topical texts. One of the churchyard's most well-known personalities was Nathaniel Butter, who, from the beginning of his career, prominently advertised his name and bookshop location in imprints. Seen here in Shakespeare's King Lear, which is published in Paul's churchyard at the sign of the Pied Bull near St. Austin's Gate. Alongside plays that dramatised England's or Britain's past, Butter became notorious as a publisher of serial news books during the early 1620s. In The Staple of News, playwright Ben Jonson describes Butter as an unscrupulous manufacturer of news, a master of the staple who knows news well, can sort and rank them, and for a need can make them. And in his continued inquisition against paper persecutors, Abraham Holland capitalizes on the humorous potential of Butter's last name and condemns him for being a paper spoiler who publishes false reports. But to behold the walls, buttered with weekly news composed in palls by some decayed captain, or those rooks whose hungry brains compile prodigious books, to see such batter every week besmear each public post and church door, and to hear these shameful lies, would make a man, in spite of nature, turn satirist and write revenging lines against these shameless men who thus torment both paper, press, and pen. The impostors that these trumperies do utter are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and... The reader is left to complete the line, but the conclusion is obvious. Butter, the churchyard's most recognisable news publisher, is the focus of the satire. Although Butter collaborated with other stationers, most notably Nicholas Bourne, he was the public face of the enterprise, and the evidence of contemporary commentaries suggests that he may have relished the publicity that these satirical attacks provided. The question of the accuracy of Butter's news publications is complicated by the limitations of news exchange and transmission during a time when, even with the best of intentions, it was often very difficult to evaluate the veracity of sources. Butter's news books were nevertheless clearly partisan. By the time of the 30 Years' War, they consistently supported military intervention in Europe on behalf of the Protestant cause. In this newsbook from 1622, the main reports covered in the pamphlet are set out on the title page, along with an imprint identifying Butter, his bookshop, and the printer by his initials. Butter's partisan interests are announced clearly through the coat of arms on the verso of the title page, which belonged to Frederick V, the Elector Palatine and Protestant figurehead of the conflict. The fact that Butter's imprints contained his name and bookshop location helped to develop and solidify his reputation and the reputation of his bookshop for newsworthy texts that demonstrate an interest in the political and secular consequences of religious warfare. Indeed, it is worth pointing out that as Butter's career continued, he sometimes identified himself by his initials only, rather than implying that he wanted to deflect attention away from his involvement. This development perhaps reveals that he had become so well known that readers could identify him just through these initials. Butter's strategies could affect readers' interpretations of his other publications, such as plays from the commercial stages. Most of Butter's playbooks are history plays that have clear potential for politic applications to contemporary events. For King Lear, the Jacobean Union debate between England and Scotland, and for plays such as Rowley's When You See Me, You Know Me, and Decker's The Whore of Babylon, the issue of militant intervention on the continent in the aid of Protestant forces. Butter's investment in these plays, advertised in the imprint, could encourage readers to be on the lookout for these kinds of readings and applications. Butter's imprints also connect his books with physical locations and construct a textual map of the southeast corner of Paul's Churchyard, an area which did not have many other bookshops. Butter seems to be physically part of the churchyard. The walls are buttered and battered with him, according to Holland's satire, and his imprints are a kind of textual performance space that develop this popular reputation. They also remain part of Butter's books wherever they go, and as a result, they reach beyond the physical community or place where the books were first published. As books were bought, sold, and traded across the country, Butter's publications carried his imprint, with its advertisement of place and authority with them. Little evidence survives about the acquisition of specific titles by booksellers in regional towns throughout the British Isles, but given that Butter's reputation was also established through other texts, like Johnson's and Holland's, it is possible that readers looked to the imprint and imaginatively constructed textual communities and cultural spaces. It is not only false imprints that command attention by offering obviously inaccurate information and/or blurring the distinction between text and paratext, but regular imprints also request imaginative engagement from readers. Imprints reveal crucial evidence about the locations and networks of early modern stationers. They often specify bookshop locations and shop signs, which makes it possible to construct maps of the book trade and the geographical histories of individual texts and their various editions. This information can help us to recover evidence about the business connections and exchanges that took place between different stationers, which in turn can help us to understand why certain texts were published in the first place. To give a short example, during the 1590s, two stationers involved in the early publication of plays from the commercial playhouses were Thomas Millington and William Barley, who invested in plays by George Peele on the left, Edward I, and Shakespeare on the right. At this time, the book trade was concentrated around St. Paul's Cathedral, which you can see here in blue. However, Barley's and Millington's shops were somewhat removed from this centre point. They're indicated here by the orange oval. So Barley's main premise was at the upper end of Gracechurch Street near Leadenhall, and Millington worked under St. Peter's Church. Their shops were almost adjacent, a proximity that makes it likely that they responded to and competed with each other's publications. One of these distinctive categories of text was professional plays, originally performed by early modern playing troupes, and they were a new textual commodity. The first professional plays in print date from 1584. Barley's and Millington's shops were in the immediate vicinity of two playing venues, the Cross Keys and the Bell Inn, which are shown by the red box next to the orange oval, and were well positioned to encourage trade from passing playgoers. They were also situated on what Holger Syme has described as a theatrical thoroughfare of playing venues, extending from the Rose Theatre on the south bank of the Thames, indicated by the red rectangle across the river, and then extending across London Bridge and up Gracechurch Street to the theatre and the Curtain Playhouses, both north of the city walls. Barley's and Millington's interest in professional plays may have been motivated by their proximity to playing venues, and the details given in imprints help us precisely to locate their bookshops. As the book trade was driven by stationers' interests and privileges, these local textual communities and networks have likely directed the selection of plays for publication and therefore shaped their survival. David McInnes and Matthew Stegall estimate that about 3,000 plays were staged in England between 1567 and 1642, and of these, about 540 survive, most often in the form of a printed edition. In the case of Millington's investment here, the first part of the contention is an alternative version of what would become known in Shakespeare's folio as the second part of Henry VI. Millington's interest in this play, and also its continuation, The True Tragedy of Richard, Duke of York, which would become the third part of Henry VI and the Folio, preserves significantly different versions of these plays, which help us to understand more about theatrical practices and textual transmission. I'll spend the last part of my talk on a more detailed and complex example to suggest how we can look to the imprint to recover details about textual networks and their influence on the selection and presentation of printed texts. With the exception of work by Helen Smith and Adam Hooks, studies of Shakespeare and early modern drama have generally overlooked the fact that during the late 1590s, Paul's Cross churchyard became a focal point for the publication of works by Shakespeare. So that's this area of the churchyard right here. Imprints, however, help us to access evidence for local networks of stationers and how they responded to each other's publications, while the design of title pages provides clues about how texts by Shakespeare were marketed, valued, and read by those who invested in them. A number of different strategies, investment priorities, and genres or kinds of texts were at play at this part of the churchyard towards the end of the 16th century. Between 1593 and 1602, all of these works, by or at least connected to Shakespeare, were published in first and subsequent editions in Paul's Cross. They include the narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, and the Rape of Lucrece, a collection of poems, not all of which are by Shakespeare, called The Passionate Pilgrim, and the plays Richard II, Richard III, I and II, Henry IV, and Much Ado About Nothing. Most of these texts proved hugely successful on the basis of edition numbers. To give a few examples, Venus and Adonis was published about 7 times by 1602. The Rape of Lucrece saw 4 editions in this time. And Richard II, Richard III, and the first part of Henry IV were published in 3 editions each. The imprints indicate and advertise the text connection to Paul's Cross churchyard. And during this time, Shakespeare's name was, from a publishing perspective, closely linked to this small area of London. Of course, all of these texts could be bought, sold, and traded across London and across the country and further afield, but it is accurate to say that this churchyard was a publishing and wholesale centre for Shakespeare, and indeed for some of his most successful works in print. Investment in Shakespeare in Paul's Cross was driven by stationer interests and networks, and imprints help us to hypothesize about these exchanges. Shakespeare's early print reputation was closely connected to his narrative poems and to his plays about the English past, which were the first kinds of text to advertise his authorship directly. Anonymity was a regular condition of print publication, and it is significant that these were the texts that first announced Shakespeare's authorship so emphatically. I think that the selection and presentation of these texts in print reflect the exchanges taking place across 3 bookshops in Paul's Cross. Those at the Sign of the Angel, the Sign of the White Greyhound, and the Sign of the Crown, locations which are named in the imprints of the books published and or offered for wholesale there. First, Andrew Wise, who operated at the Sign of the Angel, invested in 3 editions each of Richard II, Richard III, 1 Henry IV, and then with William Astley in 2 Henry IV and Much Ado About Nothing between 1597 and 1602. These successful editions established Shakespeare in print as a popular dramatist of medieval English monarchical history, a position that was solidified by the later 1623 folio, which, for the first time in a printed play collection, constructed history as an identifiable theatrical genre, alongside the classically derived genres of comedy and tragedy. Wise's early editions anticipate, as Tara Lyons proposes, the serialization of history by offering readers 4 plays about the Wars of the Roses that concentrate on some key political turning points, beginning with the war's historical origins, the deposition of Richard II, and concluding with the accession of Henry VII in Richard III. They were not alone, however, in providing a serialized history on these conflicts. And I believe that the publication of these plays reflects a responsive publishing exchange between bookshops in Paul's Cross. At the Sign of the Crown, Simon Waterson invested in Samuel Daniels' expanding narrative poem, The Civil Wars, which is based on a similar history. This poem is modelled on Lucan's Pharsalia, and it offers an English epic in ottava rima that focuses on the conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, using events from the reigns of Richard II to Edward IV in its later continuations to reflect on the Elizabethan present. Waterson published the first 4 books of the Civil Wars in 1595, and its impact was, according to John Pitcher, felt throughout the literary scene at once. It's likely that Shakespeare himself drew on these books for Richard II within weeks of the poem going on sale, which was probably in November 1595. So, at the same time as Wise invested in first and reprint editions of Shakespeare's histories, Waterson issued multiple editions of Daniel's Civil Wars, meaning that 2 serialized histories of the Wars of the Roses were published at neighbouring bookshops in Paul's Cross. In fact, the ensuing success of Wise's histories, with 9 editions by 1600, may have motivated the expansions to the Civil Wars. After the first 4 books in 1595 and the publication of a 5th book in an undated edition, Waterson asked Daniel in about 1600 to continue the series. A 6th book was then added to a new edition of the Civil Wars that appeared as part of the works of Samuel Daniel in 1601. Additionally, some of Daniel's revisions to later editions, such as the representation of the Battle of Shrewsbury in his 1609 expansion, were probably influenced by Shakespeare's English histories published by Wise. Waterson was clearly aware of the reading public's interest in these monarchs and the country's civil wars, which was perhaps compacted by the geography of the book trade and the investments of nearby stationers. While Daniel's Civil Wars is often considered a source for Shakespeare, what has not been explored is the possibility that the publication of Daniel's and Shakespeare's histories in multiple parts was spurred on by the success of these 2 ventures. These editions appeared, as shown in this table, in the following order. In 1595, the first 4 books. In 1597, Q1, meaning the first quarto of Richard II, and Q1, Richard III. In 1598, Q1 and Q3, Richard II, Q2, Richard III, Q1 and Q2, Henry IV. In 1599, the Poetical Essays of Samuel Daniel, which contains reissues of the first 5 books, and Q3, 1 Henry IV in 1600, Q1, 2 Henry IV in 1601, the works of Samuel Daniel containing 6 books of the Civil Wars, and in 1602, Q3, Richard III. They seem to indicate a kind of indirect collaboration between stationers, announced through their imprints as they respond to each other's practices and relay that exchange to their authors. This serialization may also carry interpretive significance. Some of Shakespeare's plays and the individual books of the Civil Wars end on a note of uncertainty or pessimism. Richard II concludes with Henry IV's admission of guilty remorse over his deposition of the title character, and Book 2 of the Civil Wars abruptly shifts from a celebration of worthy Elizabethans to a reminder that we must now return again to blood. publication history of these texts compounds their formal and thematic lack of closure. New installments and editions of the Wars of the Roses reinscribe these histories with a political and textual skepticism of resolution. Second, Wise's editions are also significant for the title page attributions to Shakespeare, which they consistently display from the second editions of Richard II and Richard III onwards. Prior to 1598, Shakespeare's name had not appeared on the title page of any publication, and it is likely that publication agents, rather than theatrical ones, were responsible for this new inclusion. Wise's first editions of Richard II and Richard III in 1597 do not contain attributions to Shakespeare, which implies that the marketability of his name was not immediately apparent, and that if the dramatist and or the Chamberlain's men were involved in publication, it was not part of their initial design to create a print identity for Shakespeare. The 1598 attribution, which you can see on both of these editions by William Shakespeare, is a striking development. Because the publication of reprints tended to be more narrowly controlled by stationers than first editions, which depended on the acquisition of a manuscript and involved some kind of exchange with individuals outside of the book trade, it is likely, therefore, that a publication agent such as Wise took the decision to include Shakespeare's name on later editions. Wise was also involved in the first appearance of Shakespeare's name in the Stationers' Register, which are records of the Stationers' Company that indicate the ownership of texts. Shakespeare's name appears as part of Wise and Astley's joint entry for 2 Henry IV and Much Ado About Nothing. Together, these two developments mark a shift in the status and importance of Shakespeare as a printed dramatist. It is unclear whether Richard II or Richard III was the first to appear with a Shakespeare attribution in 1598, but I believe this decision was at least partly spurred on by the activities at another bookshop in Paul's Cross, the White Greyhound, at which the narrative poems Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece were first published and offered for wholesale. Although these poems do not contain title page attributions to Shakespeare, they contain signed dedications by Shakespeare to his patron, Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, and they were the only printed texts associated with Shakespeare as named author before 1598. Both poems proved exceptionally popular with readers, judging by their numerous subsequent reprints. The White Greyhound was just 3 doors away from Wise's shop at the Angel, and so the success and strategies of the narrative poems would have been especially visible to Wise, and perhaps directed the stationer's specialization in Shakespeare's plays and the inclusion of attributions to him from 1598. In turn, the success of Wise's editions may lie behind the title page attribution by W. Shakespeare that appeared in 1599 on the second edition of The Passionate Pilgrim, an octavo collection of poems, most of which are not by Shakespeare, that was published by William Jaggard and sold by William Leake at the White Greyhound. Until this time, Shakespeare's name had only featured on the title pages of his printed playbooks. The Passionate Pilgrim became the first non-dramatic text attributed to Shakespeare on its title page, and this sequence of events suggests another textual exchange taking place between the book-selling publishers in Paul's Cross that can be followed through the imprints. So I've spent some time on this example because it reveals one of the ways in which imprints are underused in criticism. Much of our access to early modern literature, a term that I'm using broadly, depends on print publication, and imprints, alongside other title page features, help to piece together details about who invested in them and why. This methodology is particularly useful when other kinds of records, such as those directly relating to the running of a printing house or bookshop, do not survive, which is the default condition for most or many stationers in England. The function of the imprint is therefore, in this case, is contemporarily focused on the modern critic and what we can recover about textual networks and exchanges that may have taken place. But as I've also discussed, imprints are not just significant for modern criticism, they also played an important role for early modern readers. Aided by their recognizable formula and conventions, imprints could be used playfully, entering into the fictive world of a text and blurring the boundary between text and paratext. They could shape readers' interpretation of the main text by providing markers of authority and drawing attention to the reputations of specific stationers and places. The details contained in the imprint are, however, often and unproductively omitted in modern critical editions of early modern texts. I've aimed to suggest in my talk that there is a usefulness in stopping, as Nash's model of a poor reader does, to piteously torment title page imprints and ask what they can tell us about readers and textual networks. Thank you. I'll stop here.